Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fletcher Destroyer Ships. This week's episode is on the Navy's most decorated destroyer of World War II, the USS O'Bannon, and it starts right now. The USS O'Bannon DD-450 was laid down by Bath Iron Works in Bath, Maine on the 3rd of March in 1941 and launched on the 14th of March in 1942. The O'Bannon, a Fletcher-class destroyer, was the second ship of the United States Navy to be named after Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon, the Marine Corps' hero of Derna. O'Bannon was the U.S. Navy's most decorated destroyer during World War II, earning 17 battle stars and a Presidential Unit Citation. In 1945, she helped to sink the Japanese destroyer RO-115. She also participated in a battle that we covered on a recent episode about the USS Radford, KULA Gulf. In the early morning hours of July 6, 1943, the O'Bannon departed with a cruiser force as 3 targets appeared on the American radar. These were the Nizuki, leading the destroyers Suzukaze and Tanukaze, serving as a cover force for a larger troop transport mission ferrying 2,600 soldiers. The American cruiser force, the USS Honolulu, the St. Louis, and the ill-fated Helena all blasted Nizuki, sinking her with almost all hands. But Suzukaze and Tanukaze fired 16 torpedoes and retreated, 3 of which hit Helena, which broke apart and sank. The O'Bannon followed Honolulu and St. Louis in hunting down the remaining Japanese destroyers and fired a full spread of 10 torpedoes, none of which hit. The only other sinking was scored when Honolulu damaged the Nagasaki and forced her to run aground. Otherwise, the Hatsuyuki was hit 6 times, and Suzukaze twice, and Tanakaze once. But dud shell hits allowed them to escape with only moderate to light damage. This also failed to detract from the Japanese sinking far more tonnage than they lost, successfully transporting their ground troops and further suspending the American bombardment. The Battle of VELLA, LAVELLA took place on October 6 and 7, 1943. The Japanese destroyer force under Matsuchi Aijuin was cruising the northwest of VELLA, LAVELLA. Early Aijuin had detached the 3 destroyer transports along with Shiguri and Samadari to proceed towards the Marquiana Bay. In response, U.S. Admiral Theodore Stark Wilkinson, commanding the U.S. amphibious forces assigned to the New Georgia campaign, hurriedly rerouted 2 groups of 3 destroyers each to attempt to disrupt the evacuation. Only the first group arrived in time to engage combat. At 22:30, the Japanese spotted the U.S. force of 3 destroyers, the Selfridge, Chevalier, and the O'Bannon, commanded by Frank R. Walker, approaching from Villa Gulf. A second division of 3 U.S. destroyers, the Ralph Talbot, the Taylor, and the LAVELLA, under Captain Harold O. Larson, had been detached from convoy duty further south in the Solomons with orders to join up with Walker. These 3 additional ships were making speed up the west coast of VELLA, LAVELLA towards his division. Shiguri and Samadari subsequently sought to rejoin the 4 destroyers under Aijuin, who began battle preparations, while the 3 destroyer transports began to retire towards the Shortland Islands. Walker didn't wait for the 3 destroyers under Larson to come up and attacked immediately. Both sides launched torpedoes and opened fire around 2300. A tactical error by the Japanese commander resulted in his forces losing the initial advantage and placing them at a close range along with the U.S. ships' line of fire. Yogumo, first in the Japanese line after charging the U.S. destroyers and firing several torpedoes, was hit several times, knocking out her steering. She was finished off by a torpedo and sunk around 2310. However, one of her torpedoes hit the Chevalier, detonating the forward magazine. O'Bannon then collided with the crippled Chevalier, and for some time the 2 ships were locked together. Selfridge attacked alone, firing at both the Shiguri and Samadari, but was hit by a torpedo at 2306, and disabled. All 3 ships were severely damaged, and reinforcements were still 15 minutes away. The rest of the Japanese force turned away after patrol aircraft misidentified the 3 approaching U.S. destroyers as cruisers. Ijuin ordered his force and the destroyer transports to withdraw back to Rabaul while the auxiliaries completed the evacuation. The torpedo strike on the Chevalier resulted in 54 men lost and 36 wounded. The damage to the ship was so severe that she had to be scuttled the next day. Many of her survivors were picked up by the USS O'Bannon. And finally, that brings us to an event that took place in April of 1943, an event that lives on in naval lore to this day. And of course, I'm talking about the infamous potato story, and I hope that I can do half as good a job at telling it as some of my predecessors have. On the evening of April 4th, 1943, the destroyer Squadron 21, or Desron 21, a fleet of destroyers which included the O'Bannon, had shelled Japanese bases in the New Georgia area. Early the following morning, they were returning to base at New Caledonia when the O'Bannon's radar picked up a large Japanese submarine. It was cruising on the surface, seemingly oblivious to the oncoming American ship. Commander Edwin R. Wilkinson ordered the O'Bannon to speed up and ram the sub, but as they got closer to it, caution won out. What if it was a mine layer? If it was, then ramming the ship would be suicide, as the resulting explosion would destroy the ship. But the ship had already built up a momentum, so they turned the rudder so hard that the O'Bannon groaned while a large wave surged ahead to bash the sides of the cruising sub. The maneuver worked. Instead of hitting the RO-34, they banked sharply and found themselves sailing parallel to it. Still, no response from the Japanese. Looking over their railing, the Americans found out why. On the sub's deck were sailors dressed in dark shorts and blue hats, and all of them were asleep. The Allies' fascination with the sleeping Asians couldn't last, of course. First one, then another, and finally the rest woke up. Pandemonium broke out as the Japanese stared up at the gawking enemy looming over them. The American sailors wanted to open fire, but they had no guns among them. The Japanese also wanted to shoot, but they too were unarmed. According to Ernest A. Herr, who was aboard the O'Bannon at the day, silence descended as the two sides ogled each other, wondering what to do next. Military protocol didn't cover such situations, apparently. That too couldn't last. The RO-34 was armed with a 3-inch deck gun, and once the initial shock had passed, the captain realized that it might be a good time to use it. Although the O'Bannon also had deck guns, it was too close to the sub and perched up too high to do any good. The Japanese ran toward their deck gun. The Americans ran to their storage bins. No guns or grenades. Only a crate of potatoes that had been left out by the messmate to be peeled later. Desperate, they reached in and threw as many as they could at the Japanese below, hoping to keep them away from their deck gun, but knowing it was a useless gesture. They were wrong. The Japanese panicked. The brave among them picked the potatoes up and threw them overboard. Others threw them back at the Americans, who threw them back at the Japanese. It took the Americans a while to realize why the Japanese were so panicked. They probably thought that the potatoes were hand grenades. To this day, Herr isn't sure why the Japanese were so afraid of the potatoes, but he's grateful they were because they never made it to their deck gun. The O'Bannon, meanwhile, used the potato war to distance itself from the sub. It got far enough away to use its deck guns, taking out the RO-34's conning tower. The sub dived, so the destroyer surged forward again, passing overhead and dropping depth charges that destroyed the Japanese vessel. When the Association of Potato Growers of Maine heard about the incident, they sent the O'Bannon a plaque to commemorate the event. She went on to serve in the Korean War, and when she was decommissioned in 1970, the plaque was still aboard. And that brings me to something I would like to point out. Of course, it's sad to look back now and think that Probably there were no Japanese sailors who survived to tell their side of this humorous tale. But you must remember that most certainly if the captain of that sub had had half the chance, he would have most certainly and without a doubt sank the O'Bannon with all of her men aboard. Unfortunately, this is one of the sad realities of war. Now, unlike I've been accused of lately, we don't glorify death on this channel. We recognize heroism, and that's the difference. War is bad, but when we are forced to fight, sometimes heroes rise up. That's going to do it for this episode of Fletcher Destroyer Ships. I hope you enjoyed it. This is Sam, the History Man, saying, see you later.